Okay, we'll begin. Are there questions? Okay, if not, let me start. So yesterday we discussed metric fluctuation. Okay, and in fact I divided up the task into three parts. One is the fluctuation of the tensor modes, which we have already analyzed. Then it was the fluctuation of the vector modes, okay, which also is described how to analyze. And one of the conclusions was that the vector modes don't contain any dynamics, so you can just set the modes to 0. So today,
Hello. Hello.
Yes, go ahead, please.
I've asked this before, but I mean, as long as we are assuming that the prediction in this gravitational field is almost dominating normal terms.
Your voice is getting cut. I'm not sure. Can you repeat it again? Yes. I don't know if it's my problem or someone. Can anybody else hear?
No, sir. We can't hear you.
Okay, you want to try once more, Harshit?
He's saying he'll ask later.
Okay. So let me proceed. Okay. So as we are discussing we described the vector part of the metric perturbation and found that there is no dynamics. Okay. So today we will start with the scalar part. Okay. And even though we will find that there is no dynamics, it's important because this is going to mix with the fluctuation of the scalar field. Okay. So right now, let's look at the scalar part of the metric fluctuation. So for this, let me just write down the deformed metric, but keeping track of only the scalar part. Okay, so you had a minus 1 plus 2 phi dt squared. Then inside the dxi dt term, there is one term which was scalar, 2 lambda of t. And then from the hij, again, there are two terms. So lambda t squared, where delta ij plus minus so there are basically four scalar modes out in the metric: the phi, b, and then psi and. Sorry, this shouldn't be phi. I think I have used the same. No, this is e. Sorry. Okay, so phi, b, psi, and e. So the first thing we have to figure out is how they transform under gauge transformation. Okay. So here again, when we talk about gauge transformation or coordinate transformation, we will keep only the scalar modes. Okay. So the coordinate transformations are t goes to t minus xi naught of xt. Okay, so this is a scalar. Okay. And then xi goes to xi minus, earlier you had a xi I, but the scalar mode of xi is just the gradient. So xt. Okay. So two scalar gauge transformation parameters, xi naught and xi. So let's try to see what does the background metric become under a transformation like this. Because those fluctuations will not be genuine fluctuations, right? They are just an effect of coordinate change. Okay. And as last time, we'll keep terms to linear order in xi0 and xi. Okay. So the original background metric, that becomes, so there's a minus dt squared term. So that term becomes minus dt minus del t xi naught dt minus del I xi naught dxi square. And then there is a term, there's a cross term. Okay, so let's not write down the cross term. So there is a term which was dxi dxi. So let me write this as, sorry, lambda t square, I should write. So dxi will have, go to dxi minus del k, sorry, del I xi okay, and the same thing repeated like once more. Okay. And now I'm going to keep two first order in the deformation parameters. So there is a ds bar square, the original choice, that is the minus dt square plus lambda square dxi dxi term. And then to first order in deformation, let me write the result. So there is a 2 del t xi I sorry, del t xi0 d naught dx naught square okay, that comes from this cross term, okay, dt and minus del t xi0 dt. Okay. Then there's a cross term coming from here, okay. So that gives you plus 2 dt dxi times del I xi0 okay, so those are the terms from here, and from here there will be two cross terms. So one is this one, that's minus 2 lambda t square del k del I xi then dx. So okay, so this is dxi dxk. Okay, so let me dxi dxk, and then this one with this one, so minus 2 lambda t square del t del I xi dt times dxi. Okay, and now the idea is that we'll compare this deformation with this general deformation over here, okay, to figure out how these various modes phi, b, psi, and e, how they transform under these coordinate transformations. Okay. So let's start with delta phi. So 2 delta phi, sorry, 2 phi is the coefficient of the minus dt squared term. Okay. So minus dt squared, okay, is here. You can see from here, I think there is a the minus dt squared here. So delta phi is minus del t xi naught. Is that clear? Okay, just compare this with the dt squared term. Okay, that gives a delta phi. So let's just cross these terms one by one. Okay, so this term we have already taken into account. Okay, just to make sure that we take into account everything. Okay. Then let's look at this b term. Okay, so this comes as a coefficient of dxi dt and del ib. Okay. So where is dt dxi? Here is 1. Okay. So delta b, okay, this coefficient is lambda, there is no lambda here. Okay, so there is a lambda inverse del I is I naught. Okay, so that takes care of this term, and then dt dxi is here. Okay. So here there is a lambda t squared, there is a lambda, okay, and there is a minus sign. So you get a minus of lambda, and this is, so this is del ib, this is del I del t xi, so del t xi. Okay, so that takes care of this term. I think one term is missing. We'll see which term is missing. Okay, so comparing this with this, we can calculate delta E. So minus delta E gives you, so it's 2 lambda t square is the coefficient, 2 lambda t square, only the minus sign is missing. So minus xi. Okay, so that's I have. So delta psi is the only one which is missing. Okay, so that takes care of this term. So let's see where is psi hidden. There must be a psi somewhere. So here, oh yeah, okay, forgot here. See, here is lambda t squared, right? T has changed, so this should have been changed. Okay, so let me write this. Okay, first, let me remove this. So how much is the change in lambda? So this should have been lambda square plus 2 lambda dot, okay, and then the argument of lambda gets changed, right, by minus xi naught. So minus xi naught. Is that clear? So this term, okay, when combined with the leading term over here, will give an extra term minus 2 lambda dot xi naught dxi. Okay, so dxi is the delta ij coefficient, that's psi. Okay. So that gives you delta psi, as here the coefficient is lambda squared, here it's minus 2 lambda dot. So lambda dot over lambda times psi naught. Is this clear? Let me just check that I have everything. Yeah. Delta B is lambda inverse. Sorry, this del I shouldn't be there. You see, where did this come from? Lambda inverse. Yeah. See, the B already comes with the derivative, right? Del IB, we compared this with this, right? So this should have been just xi naught. Anyway, the indices don't match if you put a del I. Is this clear? Any question here? Okay. So I'm going to write down these transformation laws again, but it should be clear how you do this, right? You take the original metric and make this change of coordinates. Okay, you find how much is the deformation to first order. You compare it with the general deformations that you have written here. Okay, and that tells us how these various modes phi, b, psi, and e transform under these linearized transformations. So let me write those again. So we have delta phi as minus del t xi naught. These are the same equations that we got last time. Delta S or delta V is lambda inverse I naught minus lambda del naught psi. Delta psi is, I'll write this as H times I naught, and delta E is minus psi. Okay, so H came because it's lambda dot over lambda. Okay, because if you see in the transformation of psi, okay, there's a lambda dot over lambda. So at this stage, okay, you can proceed in two ways. One is that you can see that we can use, for example, this xi to set E equal to 0. And because lambda is non-zero, we can then use this xi naught to set B equal to 0. Okay. So one possible gauge choice is to set E equal to 0, B equal to 0. Okay, and then study the dynamics of phi and psi. Or you can use gauge invariant variables, gauge invariant combinations, and that's what we'll do at least for now. But this gauge choice will be useful later. Gauge invariant combinations. So let me write the gauge invariant combinations, and then we'll verify that this is the case. So there should be two gauge invariant combinations because there are four modes and then two gauge transformations, xi naught and psi. So phi b is phi minus d dt of lambda square E dot minus lambda b. E dot means d dt of E. Similarly, we define psi b as psi plus lambda square h times E dot minus b by lambda. So this combination, right, E dot minus b by lambda, let's check. So E dot minus b by lambda, okay, how does it transform? So this goes to E dot minus b by lambda plus E, okay, transforms the minus psi. Okay, so minus del t psi. And then minus b by lambda. Okay, so minus b by lambda, what happens to this? So b is here. So minus xi naught over lambda square minus del t psi. Okay, let me call this t. So you see the del t psi cancels. So it goes to E dot minus b by lambda plus xi naught minus xi naught over lambda square. Okay. And then you can easily convince yourself that phi and psi, okay, once you take this, for example, phi minus d dt of this, okay, so that will go to phi minus d dt of xi naught over lambda square. Okay, that, sorry, d dt of not this, but lambda square times this, right? Because the lambda square here. So if once you multiply by lambda square, okay, then you get minus xi naught, and that cancels this minus del t xi naught. Okay, so similarly for psi b. So these are, yes, go ahead, please.
Will we here also be taking lambda, like change in lambda due to the gauge transformation?
That we have already taken into account, right? That this lambda is a background lambda. Okay, that's the e to the 2h theta. Because change in lambda we have taken into account here. Right? So this lambda that appears here is a background lambda, right?
Yeah.
Okay, maybe your worried about the following, that when you change the delta, when you change this, yeah, see, that will be second order, right?
No, right?
Let's see.
It will multiply the perturbations.
Yes.
The change in lambda. And the first order change in lambda is just 2 lambda lambda dot xi 0.
Yeah, that will multiply E dot minus B by lambda. Okay, maybe there is something wrong here. Let's just check. E dot minus B by lambda, it goes to this minus. So this part is okay, or this part is also not okay, you are saying? Because lambda is there.
Yeah, this part is simply because of change in E and change in B under a gauge transformation.
Yes, I know. Yeah, so you are worried about the change in lambda.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I should think about this. Okay, I'll get back to you. Yeah.
Also in last class when we were doing the tensor perturbation and vector perturbation, maybe we didn't consider the change in lambda.
No, see, change in lambda, that will be scalar. Oh, you're talking about, see, T, we didn't transform at all last time, right? Because this is a scalar mode.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah. So that's why we didn't need to worry about this. Okay, so I'll come back to this. Okay, I'll think about this and come back to this. But I mean, you could also work with E equal to 0, B equal to 0, in which case there's a confusion. But these are supposed to be gauge invariant combinations, but I'll check why. Okay, these combinations. Otherwise, you have to add compensating terms clearly, right? If you take into account change in lambda. Okay, but maybe this is the point. Yeah, I think that this we should write not as lambda but lambda bar. Then there's no confusion, no? Because lambda bar by definition doesn't transform, right? Is that okay? Lambda bar by definition is just e to the 2ht. Okay, the background value of lambda bar. Well, even then you may wonder, what if T transforms? Okay, I'll come back with this. Okay, that I mean, what's happening here. Okay. But as I said, you can, if you work with E equal to 0, B equal to 0 gauge, then in that case, phi B reduces to phi and psi B reduces to psi.
Yeah, okay.
Any other question? Okay, so let me proceed. So if you look at the linearized Einstein's equation, so now study. And one way to study this is to first take the linearized Einstein's equation and study it in the E equal to 0, B equal to 0 gauge, and then try to write in the gauge invariant form. Okay, or you can directly analyze Einstein's equation. Okay. And the claim, okay, which I leave as an exercise to check, okay, in momentum space, the equations take the following form. This is ddt of psi hat b plus h phi hat b equal to 0. Okay, so this is the moment Fourier transform of this, and then 3h times d psi hat b dt plus h phi hat b plus k square by lambda square psi hat b equal to 0. Okay. So if you now look at these equations, we see that this implies that for k not equal to 0, this will imply that ddt of psi hat b plus h phi hat b should be 0. That in turn will now imply, using this equation, that psi hat b should be 0, right? Because this is already 0. And now that you now combine with this equation to tell us that phi hat b equal to 0. So this is the claim that there is no dynamics in the scalar modes. The gauge invariant combinations just are identically set equal to 0 by equations of motion. So there is an analog of the plane wave solution. And in terms of action, it means that if you try to substitute in the action and write down the the action involving psi hat and phi hat, okay, you will find that there are no derivative terms involving this, okay, which can give dynamics. Okay, because the equations of motion really set them equal to 0. Is this point clear?
So
Yes, go ahead, please.
yesterday you said that the same result holds for background Minkowski space, wherein even though we start with 10 components, it reduces down to 2 polarizations,
Yes,
which we see in the form of gravitational waves propagating
that's it.
gravitation.
Yes.
But does that also mean that if the background was something weird, like some complicated background with no isometries, then we would have more polarizations for gravitational waves?
So typically not, because you can't increase the number of degrees of freedom. So the number of degrees of freedom will still remain to be 2, right? But which particular modes, I mean, the definition of those modes, of course, differ from background to background.
But doesn't that mean that 8 of the 10 modes should cancel out in the sense that the perturbations are not dynamical, regardless of whatever background we are in?
Exactly. So the point is 4 of the 8 of the 10 modes are pure gauge. Okay,
Yeah.
they don't appear in the equations of motion. And then the other 4 are not dynamical.
But this statement you are saying is background independent?
Yeah, except that, I mean, when you talk about the modes, right, that definition of the modes itself, we have to expand in a given background.
Yeah.
Okay? But intrinsically, you will find that eventually, if the number of, okay, see, in complicated background, suppose there is no, suppose you put it on a compact space, right, then even the notion of propagation is not clear, right? What would it would mean by propagating degrees of freedom? Okay? But as long as there is some notion of propagating degrees of freedom, this will be true. That you will get 2 modes.
But which 2 we cannot stay from the start? It could be possible that there are 2 components of the vector mode survives and everything else gets gauged.
Even this division into vector, scalar, and tensor, right? That is specific for certain backgrounds.
Yeah, with
Right?
isometry.
Because they are in SO3 isometry. If you didn't have SO3 isometry, then even this division doesn't quite make sense, right?
Yeah, we need to work component by component like.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. And maybe I can now come back to this question that you asked. So here the point is, these are the modes already, right? And you have already taken into account the change of time coordinate, etc., to find how the modes transform. After this, you don't talk about changing time anymore. Okay, once you set lambda bar equal to c to the 2ht, there is no change in time. Okay, because it's like when you think in terms of transformation of the fields, right? In general coordinate transformation, a field transforms to the field plus the derivative of field times the change in coordinate. Okay. After you have done that, then you are not also going to change the arguments of the various functions. Okay. So here you have already transferred all the transformation laws into fields, Okay, and these are the transformation laws of which are given here. Okay? And now you think of the coordinates as fixed. Okay, you don't further transform the coordinates. Is that point clear?
No, I would say that the last slide we have the classification of the child lambda is
I think you are still not audible. Maybe if you can type in the chat, then somebody else can read it out. I cannot read chat, but maybe somebody else can translate the question. Yes, because somehow I'm not being able to hear. Did anybody else manage to hear? Then you can translate.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was saying that when we wrote in the last slide, when we performed the transformation on the metric,
Yes.
then we have already included the change in lambda in E and B.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we don't have to, add those changes again.
Exactly. Yeah. Because now lambda is just the fixed background, and that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's the argument that we have already taken that into account, and now we don't change lambda anymore. Okay. These are considered as fixed background. Is this clear, Kaustuv?
Yeah, I think it's just weird because this is a special case when the general coordinate transformation itself is the gauge transformation.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe I can put it in the following way. I think this is probably another way of explaining that you are working to linear order, right? Okay.
Yeah.
And to linear order, okay, we have to keep terms that are linear in both gauge transformation and the fields. You see, in this equation, all the terms are linear in fields and gauge transformations, right? When you write the phi and these are of the same order, right? Phi and xi's and xi naughts are of the same order.
Yeah.
If you try to transform lambda here, right? There's already a field here. It will multiply by xi. So when you go to nonlinear order, okay, these are like transforming field to field times a gauge transformation parameter. Okay, at that level, you have to rework out, right? I mean, part of it may come from lambda, but you have to rework out the whole transformation law. But at this stage, what you are looking for is the analog of delta mu equal to del mu epsilon. Okay, we are not looking at, for example, when you take a electron, right? Under gauge transformation, it transforms into theta times psi. Okay, that kind of term we are not looking at. Okay, we are just looking at the linear terms. And at that order, there is no other contribution, right? If you transform lambda here, for example, you will get a gauge transformation parameter times c. And that's a nonlinear transformation law, and you have not kept track of all the nonlinear transformation laws in this whole analysis anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it is not strictly that way, at least, because, I mean, if you simply write, let's say, psi b as some function of x comma t,
Yes.
And that is equal to some psi xt plus lambda square of t plus h of t and so on.
Yes.
There, if you do some gauge transformation, which is just a general coordinate transformation, like
Yeah.
t goes to t minus delta t is I0, then you can expand each function separately to linear order and multiply and get more terms than what you have written in terms of E dot and B.
Yeah, but those will be all.
And it is true that xi will multiply E itself.
Yeah.
And xi is it's an infinitesimal parameter, and E itself was a perturbation, so it is also infinitesimal.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it might not appear.
Right? See, because otherwise you would have to keep a lot more terms right here. I mean, you're not keeping track of those terms in this. Because otherwise you have to start from here and transform, right?
Yeah.
So we are only looking at terms that are linear, where the fields transform by terms that are just linear in the perturbation, and there are no fields on the other side.
Yeah, I see. Yeah.
So for those kinds of terms, you can not worry about extra terms over here.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, is this clear? Any other question at this stage? Okay. So this is saying that no dynamics in the scalar mode. Now suppose that we also have a scalar. We also have a scalar, but a constant potential, just as before. So the scalar field I'll continue to write by phi. This is small lowercase phi. Right? The metric perturbation had a capital phi. So we should also distinguish between the lowercase and capital phi. So scalar field phi with constant potential. Then we can separately study the fluctuation of the scalar field. And you can easily check that in the action, there will be no mixing between modes of phi and the metric. To quadratic order, okay, which means at the level of the equations of motion, it's valid to linear order. Because the phi action is already has two parts of phi. Okay, let me say phi tilde. Phi tilde is phi minus phi bar, right? Because the action of the scalar of phi tilde will already have quadratic in phi tilde. So if you now try to pick up some metric perturbation, that will be cubic, right? Those are not the terms we are keeping here. So in this case, we can calculate this 2-point function as before. And recover the previous answer, okay? Because there is no mixing between this and the metric degrees of freedom, and you just calculate this separately. So that was 2 pi cube delta cube a plus k prime times h square over 2 omega. But now consider the case of slow roll inflation. So in this case, phi bar to the background is a function of t, because phi is rolling. So phi bar dot is non-zero. Okay, and you have these various slow roll conditions that the change of phi bar dot in the Hubble time is small, and the change of the potential in a Hubble time is small, and so on. Okay. But nevertheless, phi bar dot is non-zero during inflation. And now what can happen is that when you look at the action, which is half integral d4x when you write phi as phi bar plus phi tilde, there may be terms where you pick phi bar from this, for example, okay, in which case the del t of phi bar is non-zero. So you may get terms like del t of phi bar. Here you take phi tilde, okay, del nu of phi tilde. And on this side you get g 0 nu, g t nu, or g 0 nu. there are terms like this. There'll be a factor of 2. And this, of course, is not, it's 0 at the background, in the background, but in the fluctuating metric, okay, there's an also, this is linear in fluctuation. The linear in fluctuation. Okay, this is a fixed number. This is not, this is fixed by the background. It's not a perturbation. So you see that there can be quadratic term in the action that couples metric fluctuation to the scalar fluctuation. Okay. So which means that the phi tilde will start mixing, begins to mix with psi, phi, E and B, the scalar modes of the metric. Right? You can again, the same argument that we gave earlier can be used to show that there is a mixing with the vector and the tensor modes, but there can be mixing with the scalar modes. So now the analysis becomes more complicated because you have to do the, you have to take into account this possible mixing between phi tilde and other modes. Is this clear? Now, this, in fact, we can also see from the gauge transformation law. Okay, so let's look at the gauge transformation law. So for that, you have to look at the phi bar of t, okay, the background, and see what happens under gauge transformation. The background, of course, depends only on time, not on the space coordinates, and the time coordinate is being transformed. So this becomes phi bar t minus xi naught. So that's phi bar of t minus xi naught del t of phi bar. And since we have defined phi as phi equal to phi bar plus phi tilde, we see that phi tilde changes. Okay, so phi tilde is minus del t of minus xi naught del t of phi bar. Is this point clear? So in particular, this means by choosing xi naught appropriately, we can set phi tilde to 0. So this may sound a little strange, right? That means that we can set the scalar fluctuations to 0. Now this sounds a little strange that if the scalar was fluctuating, how can there be a change of coordinate that will set it equal to 0? But if you think of it, it's not really surprising. And what is happening is the following. That if you think of the time versus space, right? So let's suppose that this is time and this is space. So in general, okay, you take your slice, okay, we take your time slice in a certain way, and if there is no, in the absence of fluctuation, we choose the time slice as the cosmic time, right? So in the absence of fluctuation, we choose t such that ds square equal to minus dt square plus lambda t square dx. Right? I mean, clearly this is not going to be the case in any time coordinate. You have to choose the time coordinate appropriately. But when we are allowing for fluctuation, then there's a preferred time as such, right? There's approximately a preferred time, okay, on the average, but there is no really preferred time because the metric doesn't have this form anyway. So now what we can do is that we can define a constant time slice. Okay, we can redefine our coordinate so that the constant time slices. Okay, earlier, if the constant time slices were like this, we choose this constant time slices to be such that phi is constant on a constant time slice. And this is possible because phi dot is non-zero. Okay, in the background, phi dot is non-zero. So imagine that to begin with, here and here, phi was not the same. So then we say that these two space-time points don't have the same time coordinate. We change the time coordinate a little bit, definition of the time coordinate here a little bit, so that phi becomes the same. Okay, because since phi is a function of time, right? If there is a small difference between phi here and phi here, you can compensate for it by simply defining time in a different way in this region. And similarly for here, here, and so on. So that's the meaning of setting phi tilde equal to 0, that you just choose your time slice in a certain way. Okay, so that phi by definition remains constant on the time slice. But of course, the price you pay is that this means that you have to redefine your time coordinate, and that changes the metric. And that's the reason the gauge transformations mix phi and the degrees of freedom of the metric. That you can make phi equal to constant if you want, but that the price that you pay is the corresponding metric also has to be changed accordingly. Okay, what is needed to make phi equal to constant? Is that point clear? So let me write down the transformation of phi again. So delta phi tilde is minus del t phi bar times I naught. And now let me remind you that delta of psi was given by minus h times I naught. So this suggests that you can construct a gauge invariant combination to zeta, which is minus, we basically will use both zeta and this negative, giving it a different name, mostly for historic reason, h over phi bar dot times phi tilde. I think something is wrong. Somewhere I missed a minus sign somewhere. Okay, maybe there is a relative minus sign between the two. Psi transformation was, no, psi didn't have a minus sign. Sorry, psi had just h times I naught. Okay, that's why this is getting invariant. So this is gauge invariant. And I'll just define R, which is minus zeta. Okay, this has to do with some spatial curvature, which is psi plus h over phi bar dot times phi tilde. Yeah, other questions? Okay, so now in the combined, action, what we can now analyze the combined action. Okay, so there should be one physical modes. So one way to analyze the combined action is that if we use zeta or E equal to B equal to 0 gauge, then Einstein's equations still set psi equal to 0 and phi equal to 0. Okay, that basically means the psi b and phi b. Okay, in the E equal to B equal to 0 gauge, these terms, basically these terms are still set equal to 0. And in this case, the dynamics of phi tilde remains the same as before. Okay, it remains the same as before because the cross term now doesn't have any role to play because that term has been set equal to 0 anyway. Okay, because of this gauge condition and the equations of motion. So we can calculate this phi hat of k and get the same answer as before. But the advantage of going through this process is that now we can translate this into a statement on the gauge invariant quantity R. So from this equation, okay, so psi has been set equal to 0 in this gauge. Okay. So you can calculate the RR two-point function, and once you have calculated it, then that's gauge invariant. It doesn't matter which gauge you work with, you'll always get the same answer. Okay. So RR two-point function from here, okay, let me write that down. So this implies that R hat k tau, R hat k prime tau is given by Q by Q so you have this h square over 2 omega cube, and then you have this additional factor of h square over 5r dot square. Okay, that's from this h over 5r dot. Okay, because there are two factors, they are square. Okay, cross terms are all 0 in this gauge. Okay, are there questions? So this I'll again leave as an exercise. Okay, so the calculation that we did earlier, okay, is not totally useless, okay, because you can actually use that same calculation of this two-point function of scalars to now calculate the two-point function of this gauge invariant quantity, okay, even though this by itself is not gauge invariant.
No, why do we have two scalar modes?
Why do you have two scalar modes? No, we have only one gauge invariant scalar mode, right? R. The zeta is just another name for R. It's a minus, up to a minus sign. Is that what you mean by two scalar modes?
I mean, we wrote phi and R, right?
We wrote
Correlation function for phi and R.
Yeah. So this result, I'm saying that if you work in this gauge, right, then together with Einstein's equation, it basically sets all the metric perturbations to 0. Then the phi tilde analysis can be carried out as before. right? Because there's a cross term. The cross terms don't matter because the metric vanishes anyway. So using that, so in this gauge, we can calculate this. Even though phi hat is not gauge invariant, right? It's a gauge dependent statement. That 2-point function of phi hat, the fact that it is equal to this, is a gauge dependent statement, okay, in this gauge. But given this, we can now calculate this 2-point function of r hat, okay, which is the gauge invariant mode.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, and that's what we calculate. We read out from here because the psi vanishes in this gauge. The 2-point function of r hat is just that h over phi bar dot square times 2-point function of phi hat. And that's what we have written down. Okay, so this is really the relevant formula for now.
The phi bar dot is a constant.
Phi bar dot is time dependent, slowly varying, right? But it doesn't matter because you're working at a fixed time here.
Okay.
Okay, and in fact, in inflation, h also varies slowly, right?
Yeah, for de Sitter it is just constant, right?
Yeah, for de Sitter, of course, h is constant and phi dot is 0. Okay, so this construction doesn't make sense really for de Sitter because there is no mixing in de Sitter.
Yeah, okay. We need to take the V of phi.
Yeah, we need to take into account the fact that the v of phi is not totally constant, and that's what makes the phi role. Is this clear? Okay, so now let me give some, write down some formula and then give some definitions. Okay, I'll write this formula again in the next slide, okay, because that will be, oh, maybe I should have said one more thing. Okay, so this equation, okay, because h is not a constant, okay, but very slowly, and similarly phi bar dot is not constant but very slowly. Suppose you want to calculate the tau goes to 0 limit of this. Okay, taking into account this time that it's not de Sitter. Remember that we did our calculation in de Sitter, right? This 2-point function calculation we had done in de Sitter. Okay. Now it's not de Sitter anymore, okay, but it's approximately de Sitter, and that's why you are using this formula. Okay, if it was far away from de Sitter, we couldn't have used this formula. You have to redo this calculation. So given this, I can ask that suppose I want to calculate now this in the far future, okay, as tau goes to 0, t goes to infinity. Then which h and phi bar dot should we use? Is it the h as tau goes to 0 and phi bar dot as tau goes to 0 really? Because then of course during inflation h eventually the potential eventually drops to 0. Similarly, phi bar dot, I mean phi, this becomes rapidly varying. But that's not what you should use, okay? Because you have used this calculation for de Sitter, and of course once it stops being de Sitter, this formula is not valid anymore anyway. So the correct procedure to do is the following, okay? And this is again tied to the discussion we had a few days ago. So remember this graph of lambda inverse h inverse versus time. So given an omega, there's a horizon exit time. And this time of exit may not be sharply defined, right? Because I mean here it's, I mean you can, okay, it's sharply defined in the sense that if you just define it by this, right, this omega inverse, then it's sharply defined. Okay? But it's not that the perturbations immediately stop being affected by quantum effects, right? Because there is, you saw that there is 1 over 1 plus omega square tau square, right? Term, and this becomes the omega square tau square becomes dominant when omega tau is much larger than 1, okay, or when when this starts dominating, when omega tau is much smaller than 1. That means omega inverse is much larger than tau, which is lambda inverse H inverse. So it takes a while. Okay, you have to go beyond. But because because H and phi dot are changing slowly, right? That's the advantage of using this slow roll inflation. Whereas this is changing rapidly, okay, in the sense the rate of change of this lambda inverse H inverse is like a Hubble constant, right? It changes by, it roughly doubles in a Hubble time. And we have seen that the variation of phi dot and H, H dot, okay, so phi dot and H changes little during Hubble time. That's the slow roll condition. The two slow roll conditions that we wrote down, they change little during time H inverse. Okay. So by the time this condition, okay, that omega tau starts forming much larger than 1 and becomes eventually much less than 1. Okay, that interval, during that interval, phi bar dot and H are almost constant. So it makes sense to say that we just use the phi bar dot and H at T star, even though, okay, it may not be exactly at T star, it may be maybe half T star or twice T star, okay, but it doesn't really make a difference because phi bar dot and H doesn't change very much during that time. So we need to calculate Is this point clear? After this, you have to start evolving classically. Okay, and that we'll see how to do later. But this quantum calculation is valid when you are in de Sitter, and this inflationary phase can be regarded as approximately de Sitter for certain ranges, but because H changes eventually, okay, it's not exactly de Sitter. So it's at the horizon exit, okay, that's why the dynamics is important. At the horizon exit, whatever was the value of H and phi bar dot, that's what you are going to use in this formula. In this formula as well as the formula for the tensor contribution that I'm going to write down.
So did you just say omega changes rapidly?
No, not omega changes rapidly. This one changes rapidly. Omega is fixed, right? Because there is a lambda here, right?
And lambda is small, that's why you're saying?
No, because lambda has is e to the 2ht, right? E to the ht. Lambda is c to the ht. So lambda doubles every Hubble time, right?
Yeah.
In time H inverse, lambda doubles. But during that time, so by the time this thing becomes half, phi bar dot and H don't change very much. Because that's a slow roll condition, right?
Yeah.
That during time H inverse, phi bar dot and H shouldn't change much. So the statement is that the time that it takes, okay, for this omega tau to start from much larger than much larger than 1 to much less than 1, right? Because as tau is going to 0, omega tau is decreasing. Okay, so it has to go from much larger than 1 to much less than 1. That interval, during that interval, phi bar dot and H remain more or less fixed. And that's the value of phi bar dot and H you should use in this formula. Okay, that we have done for de Sitter calculation. Is this clear?
Yeah.
So the point is, if these things had changed rapidly, as rapidly as this, right? Then you can say, okay, it doesn't really make sense because by the time omega tau has gone from say 10 to 1/10, these have changed also by a lot, right? So which value of these we should use? at 10 or 1/10. What I'm saying is that whether you use it at 10 or 1/10, it doesn't really make that much difference, because phi bar dot and h don't change much during that time. Okay, during the time in which omega tau goes from 10 to 1/10. And that, for that reason, for that to work, the slow roll condition is important. Okay, otherwise you have to do much more work to figure out what is the effective phi bar dot and h we should use here. Is this clear?
Yeah.
Any other question? Okay, so now let me give some definitions. So you have the r hat k tau, r hat k prime tau. I'm going to write the same formula again. This is 2 pi cube delta cube k plus k prime times, let me write, h to the 4 over 2 phi bar dot square omega square, omega cube. Did I write omega square or omega cube? Yeah, omega cube. So this quantity has a name. So this is called scalar power spectrum. So this is normally denoted by PR, and it's called scalar power spectrum. Okay. And later on, we will see that these quantities can be directly related to what you see in the CMB. Okay, so these are direct implication for CMB spectrum, or the fluctuations in the CMB spectrum. Now, let me also remind you that you had this other formula, h hat s of k tau, h hat s prime of k prime tau. These are a similar formula, 2 pi cube delta cube k plus k prime. Now there is no h square over 5 odd dot factor, but we had a factor of 4. So this was 2h square over omega cube. And then a delta ss prime. So we consider the following object, sum over s equal to 1 and 2, h hat s k tau, h hat s k prime tau. Okay, we basically sum over this polarization. So this is given by 2 pi cube delta cube k plus k prime. This delta ss prime, this becomes 1, and then we are summing over 2 values, so this becomes 4h square by omega cube. So this one is called the tensor power spectrum. Okay, these are just definitions. Is this clear? Are there questions? Okay. So some more definitions. Okay, we define amplitudes of these perturbations. So some more definitions. So delta S square is defined as omega cube over 2 pi square times PR, the amplitude of the scalar fluctuation, that's delta S. And this you can just read out from the previous one. So the omega cube cancels this omega cube, and you get this omega cube, and you just get this h to the 4 over 2 phi bar dot square, and then there's a 2 pi square. So this is h to the 4 over 4 pi square phi bar dot square. So this doesn't contain any new information. It's just some combination. And similarly, the tensor amplitude, which is 2h square over pi square. Okay, because there's a factor of 4 in this expression, so that 4 can't combine with 2. Here there's a half, so that gets this 4 in the denominator. Now you can see from this formula is that delta S and delta T are approximately omega independent. Now note that I have said approximately, and the reason that is it doesn't have explicit it doesn't have manifest dependence on omega. Nevertheless, this h and phi bar dot have to be valued at T star, right? So T star depends on omega. Okay, we have this omega inverse equal to lambda T star inverse h of T star inverse, right? That formula. So T star depends on omega, and h and phi bar dot depends on T star, but mildly. So omega independent delta S and delta T, this is known as scale invariant spectrum. And as I already said, that this has been observed in CMB observation, but even before the discovery of CMB, just from the requirement that the structure forms in the way we see them, it was already predicted that we should have nearly scale invariant spectrum. Okay, that's what is called the Harrison-Zeldovich spectrum. Okay, and we see that the inflation, in a sense, naturally gives the scale invariant spectrum. But at the same time, a given model of inflation also predicts deviation from scale invariance, right? Because h and phi bar dot. So deviation from scale invariant which basically means that mild dependence on omega. This is captured in this quantity called spectral index. Okay, we'll define it later, to be defined later. Okay, but let me just point out that there is such a deviation from scale invariant spectrum, okay, that is predicted by inflation. And now the recent experiments have actually confirmed that indeed spectral index is non-zero. Okay. And the inflation also predicts precise sign of the spectral index. Okay. And that also has been confirmed. Okay, you can see why it should predict a precise sign of the spectral index, right? Because what this is saying, okay, let's look at this, for example. Okay, this has not been observed, but let's look at this. Basically, what it is saying is that the Hubble constant decreases as a function of time, right? That's what inflation tells us, because the potential is decreasing. So because the Hubble constant is decreasing as a function of time, we know that the larger the horizon crossing time, the lower should be delta S. Okay, so that already tells you that there is a directional effect. Okay, larger is the value of T star, the lower is delta S. And if you go back to that this diagram earlier, you can see the larger T star means smaller omega inverse, right? As you bring this curve down, the horizon crossing happens at a later time. So this already tells you that if there is a deviation from scale invariance, in which direction it should go to. Okay, and that has also been confirmed by experiments. Okay, so this again we'll discuss later.
So would you say again what was the reasoning behind there being scale invariance?
Yeah, so the original reasoning, right? This Harrison-Zeltovich, this reasoning was given, as far as I remember, even before the fluctuations in the CMB were discovered, is by saying that let's suppose that there is some perturbation at the time of CMB, and those perturbations would have grown and formed the structure, right? Which form galaxies and clusters and superclusters and of the kind that you see. So working backwards, we can ask what kind of fluctuations would have produced those structures. And from that analysis, they concluded that what we need is a nearly scale invariant spectrum to begin with, okay, to be able to form the kind of structure that we see in our universe.
Is that again a statement of isotropy in our universe today?
No, it's a statement of fluctuation. See, isotropy and homogeneity is a statement of averages, right? Averages over large scales.
Yeah.
But how the densities fluctuate, right? I mean, we know that at smaller length scales, the matter clumps more, right? As you start averaging over larger length scales, it becomes more uniform. But you also have a good understanding of how it approaches uniformity as you average over larger and larger scales. And from that information, you can work backwards and you can predict what kind of fluctuations must have started this evolution.
Oh, so the meaning of scale invariant spectrum is it something like whether I average over 5 degrees or over 20 degrees, the average and the deviation in the average at specific points is similar?
Well, it's, I mean, one has to be, okay, it's in that spirit that they are related, the averages over different scales. But you have to do some work to work out the precise relation between what you should observe and what kind of perturbation you start with. But in spirit, what you are saying is right. The fluctuations at different scales should be related, right? You can define fluctuations over small scale, fluctuations over large scale, and given the current data, right? I mean, we in fact know the current data not only today but also in the history of the universe, because as you look farther and farther out, you look at earlier and earlier images of the universe. Right? So from all that data, right, you can try to predict what kind of perturbation must have started the structure formation. Yeah, and that requires the nearly scale invariant spectrum. If it was not scale invariant, right, you would have seen different kind of structure.
Okay. And like we are yet to show that, right? That in the CMB fluctuation only delta S and delta T come in and omega does not come in.
Yes, so we'll see that how to relate these to CMB fluctuations.
Yeah, okay.
And what I'm saying is that, I mean, when you make that relation, that how you relate it to CMB fluctuation, is a constancy of these that eventually ensures that the kind of structure that we see today will be formed. Okay, but how we relate these to CMB fluctuations, I have not discussed certainly, right? That will be during the next few lectures. Eventually we'll get there.
Yeah, okay.
Any other question?
Sir, in the definition of delta square, you absorb omega cube because you wanted to study fluctuations at physical distance scales. Is it?
Yeah, I mean, you can motivate it that way, right? But basically what we'll see that this is this combination, right, that enters naturally in the CMB spectrum.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, basically it's the phase is the phase space volume is like omega squared d omega, right? So that's where this omega cube is coming in. Okay, if you look at the how much volume is there in the phase space between, say, energy omega and energy omega plus omega times 1 plus epsilon, right? That volume is proportional to omega cube, right? And that's why this omega cube is there. That's why it's natural to have this omega cube.
Okay.
Okay, so I have some more definitions to give, and then we'll work out the various relations and bounds. Okay, but maybe I'll do that tomorrow. Okay. So are there other questions at this stage? So Harshit, you may want to ask your question again. You had asked something, tried to ask something at the beginning, right?
Yeah, this is, I mean, I got confused a bit. I mean, I thought we could, like, as we were doing for all the other fields, like photons and neutrons and other fields, we wrote something like a thermal ensemble. So now when we are at least looking at the field, this linearized field, could we write something like thermal ensemble for those fields? The
Thermal
gravitational
ensemble. Yeah, you're asking about thermal ensemble for those fields?
for gravitational modes.
Yeah, you could, except that in de Sitter, I mean, because the intrinsic thermal temperature actually goes down to zero very fast, right? As the universe is expanding, because the universe expands exponentially. And that's why you don't worry too much about the thermal fluctuations here during inflation. Because the intrinsic, the real statistical temperature actually has gone down to zero, right? Because the radiation and everything else has gotten diluted very fast. But at the same time, it is also true that this correlation function that we find, right? I said that there is an enhancement factor of this h square over omega square enhancement factor. That can be re-understood as some kind of intrinsic temperature of de Sitter. But this is different from the standard thermodynamics. Okay, this is more, I mean, closer to what we think of as Hawking radiation from a black hole. Right? The black hole also behaves like a thermal object, but it's not clear what that there's an underlying statistical mechanics. Right? One believes that maybe there is some way to think of this as statistical mechanics, but the thermal nature of black hole comes from purely quantum analysis, and this is similar, right? I mean, so while it is true that you can interpret this as if there is an intrinsic temperature of de Sitter, and that intrinsic temperature in fact doesn't fall. I mean, normally if you think that the usual statistical temperature T will fall off as 1 over lambda, but the de Sitter temperature is fixed by h. Okay, it doesn't fall. And but with that interpretation, you can think of this enhancement is coming because it's in a thermal bath rather than at zero temperature. But the real statistical temperature actually has gone to zero because of this rapid expansion.
Yeah.
Okay, any other question?
Sir, I had a question from field theory.
Okay, from field theory. Okay, so maybe I can stop this. Are there any other questions in cosmology?
Sir, I had something regarding like unstable black holes.
Okay, unstable black holes, that's part of cosmology. Okay.
I mean, it's your call. I don't know.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, when we say that a black hole is unstable, like, do we mean it will collapse or something in due time?
No, see, black hole being unstable, right?
In the sense of horizon being unstable, I mean.
Okay, so normal black hole horizon, the outer horizon is not unstable typically, right? The outer horizon being unstable means the black hole would, split or do something, right? By the very fact that it's horizon, right, means that a black hole, for example, cannot just break up into two black holes. Inner horizon sometimes is unstable.
Yeah, but
So
what
the
does that
instability of the black hole is only via Hawking radiation.
Would you repeat that?
The instability of the black hole, right, a regular Schwarzschild black hole, is only via Hawking radiation. A black
So
hole,
what
for
does-
example, is not unstable against splitting up into two black holes.
Yeah, but what does instability in terms of a horizon or black hole mean? Like in a like if I were to give an analogous picture of, let's say, some normal classical equations, nonlinear equations,
Yeah.
instability there would mean that it will go out of equilibrium, or it will go into chaos in due time. Like if you wait long
Okay.
enough or something like that.
Instability here means that if you take a black hole solution and make a small perturbation, right, that you start with the initial condition where it's the black hole metric plus a small perturbation, then the perturbation grows with time exponentially. If there's a mode, for example, which grows as exponentially lambda t, then that is what we call instability. And the outer perturbation near the outer horizons are not like this. Okay, they in fact decay, because whatever you do in the outer horizon, the disturbance eventually falls into the black hole and dissipates. Inner horizon is known to be unstable. If you have, for example, a charged black hole or Eisner-Nordstrom black hole, and the physics of that is not fully understood. Okay, that basically people interpret by saying that the inner horizon really doesn't exist and it should be replaced by something else.
I mean, if you were to take this seriously, that whether it decays or it like goes out, I mean, blows up, the perturbation over the black holes at the horizon, but that would still take infinite time for us to observe, right?
Yeah.
So,
But see,
even though it is unstable,
outer horizon is never unstable. So there's no question of our observing instability at all, right? Anything that is unstable will be in the inner horizon that we cannot see anyway.
yeah. So, I mean, if I were to like throw the argument the other way around, like usually one would want to say for a classical system, let's say, that if it's unstable, then you will, and if it's instability is like it goes into chaos regardless of the initial condition, then you would always observe it in chaos, because you'll expect that due time has passed in this in observational sense. But that we shouldn't be saying for black holes and all that. Eisner-Nordstrom black holes won't exist since the inner horizon is unstable.
Yeah, but Eisner-Nordstrom black hole may still exist, except the description near the inner horizon should break down. It should be replaced by something else.
Not in our frame, right? In the sense that until you go inside the horizon.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So for us, it doesn't matter what happens there.
Yeah.
Right. Because you are only going to see outer horizon.
Yeah. So the instability is not related to whether we'll observe it or not.
No. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So instability of the inner horizon we can never observe.
Okay.
Yeah, because if you look at the light cones, right, you can clearly see that the disturbance, anything that happens at the inner horizon, is not going to come out.
Yeah. So even if it's an exponentially growing, chaotic sort of a behavior of the perturbation, we need not say that like it isn't there. In the sense that the inner horizon is
except
not.
that in principle, you could jump into the black hole and see what's happening, right? You may not be able to tell us back what happens. But
yeah.
This kind of question, okay, some people may take the viewpoint that these kinds of questions don't make sense. But you may also take the viewpoint that, okay, it should make sense because you could, in principle, jump into the black hole and see what's going on, right?
Yeah.
So if you want to be safe, then you cannot say what's happening. But if you're willing to sacrifice yourself and figure out what's happening, you could do that in principle.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so let me stop this and then we can come back to Harshit's question.